What's up guys, welcome to the video today. So the reason that working upon your techniques in this way and building the foundation of your training on the basic techniques, let's say, is because you work to refine them over time and make them more efficient. And for the purposes of this video, I'm going to define efficiency as essentially removing any superfluous movements from your techniques. And I know that's a fancy word, superfluous, but it basically just means removing anything that's unnecessary. And so why would you want to do this then, not just do something that's kind of fun and novel? And that's because really everything else stems from this. And so if you pay diligent attention to this, it's going to have knock-on effects to everything else you do in your training, because really any advanced techniques that you do always start and come from the basics. And I'm sure you're in agreement with me on this, that I've seen so many fighters really try and throw techniques that I would say they've got absolutely no business trying to execute because they haven't worked on those basics. Now, people are always trying to overcomplicate their training and look for special methods, you could say, but really that just makes them kind of miss the point entirely and splits their attention too many ways. So people are always asking, what can I do? And this sparks them to search on YouTube for videos like this, actually looking for tactics of things to do. But I think what's actually more beneficial is for them to ask, what should I remove in order so they can get closer to those bare essentials and those basics? But really the best athletes in any endeavors always have training plans that are very simplistic. So if it works for the elite individuals in that activity, then why does the layman need all these advanced techniques? So if we have a look at this diagram that represents what happens when you split your units of attention many ways between lots of different training methods, for instance, as opposed to one, which represents what happens when you focus on one or very, very few. And I really like this diagram because it's just such a stark visual example of the kind of progress that you can expect to make when you focus and hone in your attention on one specific set of skills.
Skills I've acquired over a very long career.
Rather than splitting it many different ways. And I think really this happens because people are kind of bored and they don't want to just put those hours into doing the same things all the time, which is why to get to any level of proficiency or even to expect to, you must really enjoy what you're doing and you must have fun while you're doing it. But I'd say that the majority of martial arts schools, all of the different drills and things that they put their students through are really just clever ways of training the basics and making them more entertaining so they don't get bored just doing the same thing all the time. Before we move on in this video though, really the whole encompassing point of training the basics is it's because, as I already said, that's what all of the advanced skills are made up of. And people sometimes contest this fact and talk about more advanced professionals and stuff and say, oh yeah, but he didn't do that, look, he was doing this thing and like breaking those rules. But that doesn't apply to the majority of people who are just beginners, because there's kind of like a sequence of events that happens, which is learn the rules or the basics, perfect the rules, and only then can you break the rules. But people want to jump straight to point 3 and start breaking the rules before they've even gotten anywhere close to mastering the basics. So really what we're talking about here is efficiency in movement, and every single technique you do is going to have ways of making it more efficient. So for instance, if you're pulling your punches back along the same line, that makes it more efficient than if you just drop it and have to lift it back up. That's really a very beginner example, but something that a lot of people struggle with. And as I touched on there, one of the biggest issues facing most people with this stuff is having a lack of that efficiency, which really contributes to fatigue over time, because each movement they're doing is using just a little bit more energy than it should, and over the space of say a workout or a training session, that fatigue really accumulates and they find themselves getting exhausted easily. So through repeated exposure to certain movements and movement patterns over time, basically you refine them, making them more efficient. And another way to look at it is that you basically become more familiar with the movements on a level of the body's innate intelligence. So in order to explain, we can look at a movement like the burpee. And it's common for those who don't train often in these to do it in stages, or when they've just started out, with a slight pause in between. So it's almost as if the movement becomes 3 separate movements. But as you become better at these, those stages tend to blend together and it forms like a single fluid movement without that pause in between. And due to that familiarity through just repeated exposure to the movements, as I touched on in the previous point, that person will actually be using less energy despite doing a seemingly more difficult version of the movement, so doing it all in one go, rather than the beginner who does it in those 3 stages. And the term economy of motion is kind of a blanket phrase that I often use to describe this efficiency in the techniques. And in the context of martial arts, it usually refers to focusing upon direct, simple and effective techniques that allow practitioners to execute strikes and movements with minimal telegraphing or wasted motion. Now, because the basics make up everything else and also act as a prerequisite to more advanced techniques, that means that you can kind of skip some stages, you could say, or you could level up faster. So a simple example is if you've got a really nice standing hook kick, then doing a spin hook kick is going to be so much easier. And that's something that's quite easily understood by the majority of people, but I think there's actually something far more profound profound and beneficial that goes on as a result of doing this as well. Developing a deep level of skill across a broad range of basic techniques provides the foundation not just of technique, but of overall bodily control and awareness that makes you able to perfect other skills that you haven't necessarily trained in much faster than you otherwise would be able to. And efficiency in movement will be specific to every person's unique sport and activity, but then there's this overall level of becoming more capable of working with the body and movement in general. And again, this is a trait that's almost like a cheat code to leveling up in other disciplines much more easily. So a simple way to describe that would be to take the example of somebody like a dancer and how they would adapt to the movements of martial arts much more easily than someone like a powerlifter. And that's because the movements of dance, although its own unique discipline, much more closely mirror the movements of martial arts because of things like the speed and precision over the movements that, say, a powerlifter would use to just optimize for max strength. Now, one of the biggest benefits that comes from this repetition of techniques is it develops your muscle memory, which allows you to instinctively react under pressure in the right way, the way you've trained it, rather than overthinking and getting yourself all tied up and too tense. And that is so crucial because efficacy in martial arts is optimal when the mind is absent. And the degree to which a martial artist is tense and too in his head, and you can see it all over somebody's face when they're thinking too much about it, it stifles their movements and makes them stiff and tense. That directly correlates with the narrowing of their options in any given situation. So this improves your balance and coordination as well, which is another massively important area of martial arts because the basics don't just refer to individual strikes or techniques. Footwork and movement is a part of that as well. And of course, that's a huge part of developing that bodily awareness because everything starts with the feet. So it's going to reduce the risk of losing balance or making unnecessary and foolish mistakes. And something I don't see spoken about nearly enough is the kind of knock-on effect this has to preventing injuries and just keeping you safe in your practice, because I speak to so many people who are always telling me how they've got all of these like niggling injuries and stuff, and that's just something I've never had. I always wondered why people were getting injured all the time in their training. And you know, poor technique can lead to muscle strain and injuries, and over time, if you've got muscle imbalances from constantly throwing kicks in and suboptimal way, for instance, it can really affect your posture. So drilling those fundamentals and then building up the speed and intensity ensures you're going to have proper form, as well as reducing unnecessary stress on your joints and your muscles. This stuff also goes way beyond the physical in my personal opinion, because as I already touched on earlier, people don't want to do this stuff because they just find it boring. So there's a degree of mental training in this as well, and building that mental discipline, because repetitive training develops focus and perseverance, because let's face it, it's quite boring, like to just show up and do the same thing every single day, but really that's what it takes. And that's especially compounded when you're actually weak in a certain area. Everyone has weaknesses in their training, but I'm sure you can relate that working upon those weaknesses is so much more mentally taxing than just going and doing what you're good at. But I would say if you can make yourself do this and you can dedicate time and not listen to what your mind's telling you and sort of force yourself to work on those weaker areas, even just for a portion of your practice, that's going to benefit you massively in other areas of your life as well. Because life is not always about doing things you want to do. There's going to be aspects of every endeavor you take on that you don't enjoy. So why not use your martial arts training as a kind of practice arena for this type of stuff? Obviously, this is going to develop a much greater adaptability in combat and self-defense situations as well, because if you can execute what I call like a copy-paste technique where you can do it very, very well every single time you do it, almost identically the same each time, then when you're, say, in a sparring match or something and you might be knocked off balance, you'll still have the efficacy to be able to execute that punch from a suboptimal position. And the way that works in my experience is that when you first start something out, you'll struggle to execute the technique right at all. Then eventually you might get every 1 in 10 executed well or pretty efficiently. Then more time will go by and you get 2 out of 10 right, then more time and 3. And as you go up in those numbers, the time and time gets longer to where you eventually get to 10, and that can be years and years of practice and refinement. And the greatest martial artists or sports people in general are always working on their basics. They never stop. And that's exactly what Bruce Lee was getting at with that quote that appeared at the beginning of the video. I fear not the man who's practiced 10,000 kicks one time, I fear the man who's practiced one kick 10,000 times, which speaks directly to the power of repetition. And I think to wrap up this video, the thing that I like about working on these basics is it really keeps everything simple. It just breaks the process down into a few key elements and kind of removes all of this like scientific stuff that people are trying to get obsessed with nowadays. I understand the sentiment of that because it's trying to study training methods so people aren't doing something wrong and wasting their time, but I think often that can just tie them up further in knots and confuse them. And so there is a lot of virtue to just saying, just go out and lift weights, or just go out and start practicing. And really that's what I did. When I was a kid, I just watched some superheroes and went out and copied their movements, and then that's led up to what I am today. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, guys. Please join my Telegram group for other resources that I can't really share on YouTube and not really applicable, a few mindset insights and things, as well as some tutorials and other things that I'm doing, and I will see you in the next video.